Hello everyone, we are pleased that you could join us today. Our program today is going to be a bit different, as we are going to take you a step back in time and reminisce a bit. Seated with me is Ralph Freese, who has prepared some slides and diagrams of buildings that housed various businesses that were scattered along Hershey Avenue in the early 1900s. This section of the community was then known as Sloughtown. Now let's watch and listen as Ralph presents his commentary.
Thank you, Jerry. If you'll notice on the diagram that we have here on the overhead, let's start out with the streetcar tracks. Jerry, I remember talking to you earlier when we were putting this program together that remember the streetcar tracks came down along the high sidewalk in Front Street, which was known as in those days. Today it's known as Mississippi Drive. But I recall you saying that some of the kids used to lean out that window and grab some of the things because it came so close to the
That's true.
to the hill, and the motorman kind of frowned on that and discouraged that because it was very dangerous. So looking at our diagram now, if you'll notice where my pointer is on number 1, I recall, and I don't go back as near as far as some of you people might be viewing this morning, but I recall that that was a barge there that was moved in from the Mississippi River. As I recall, Fred Angel had a barge out there on the Mississippi during Prohibition days, and I understand that on Sundays they had dances there and had beverages that were legal apparently on the river, but they were not legal in the states. Now, after Prohibition was repealed in I think it was April 15th in 1933, there was no longer really any revenue that was possible on the barge, so Mr. Angel moved that barge into the present spot where you see my pointer is here on number 1. And in a few years, the family by the name of Young ran a restaurant there. That was my first recollection of the barge in that position.
If I can stop you right there, Ralph, and go back to the streetcar, I recall an incident that my dad told me about when he used to be a motorman on the streetcar, and there's at times where seemed to be some ornery kids that would knock the trolley off the wire, which always presented a problem because the motorman had to get out of the car and set the trolley back on. This one incident was on a rainy day, and evidently one of the boys or whoever knocked the trolley off, and it so happened that the trolley went right straight up in the air with a rope dangling from it. Well, my dad was sort of a portly man, and he says, there's no way that I can climb on top of that slippery streetcar. So there was a boy right there in the vicinity, so he gave the boy a dime to get up there and pull the trolley down so he can refasten it to the streetcar. And the boy went his way and Dad went his. And Dad said he got to thinking after that, I wouldn't be surprised I paid that kid a dime, and he was the original one that tore the trolley off of the wire.
No doubt that was possible. Then I moved my pointer down to number 2 there, and that used to be a city service gas station ran by a fellow by the name of Charlie Roseman. It was a member of the Roseman family that was quite prominent in the Sloughtown area at that time. Moving on down now, we're going west on Hershey Avenue to number 3, and that was an old Fred Bumpke coal yard. And I can recall delivery by, I guess, it was trucks in those days, but more often than not, young kids used to come up with a coaster wagon and also a gunny sack, because those were Depression days, and it was difficult for some of those families to get together enough money to buy a ton of coal or even a half ton. So they'd send the kids up there for a coaster wagon full of coal or a gunny sack full of coal and carried it home. And it seems to me that you had shared with me that Mr. Bumpke from time to time used to have to go out and collect for those bills.
Yeah, that's very true, Ralph. Most of his business was done on a credit basis, and people more or less paid so much a week, whatever they could spare, and Mr. Bumpke even came to the house to collect that money. And I thought what a nice man he was to see that all the people in those days were more or less poor, and to see that they had coal, and also to accept in payment whatever they had to offer. I'm certain that they paid on their coal way into the spring, like the coal that they had already burned, almost like paying for a dead horse. But that's the way it was in those days, and Mr. Bumke should have been really complimented for his running his business in that way.
Right. I'm sure in those days the merchants were very understanding because things were tough, and money was hard to come by. I moved my pointer up now to the west end of 2nd Street, the way west end. Part of the street now is closed, but recall, Jerry, the boardwalk that used to be along there was just actually 2 planks parallel to one another, and we used to walk up that boardwalk and go up over the hill and downtown, and we always had a lot of fun making that walk.
I recall how slippery that walk used to get too in the wintertime and also after it rained.
That's very true. I moved my pointer on down to number 4 on the chart now, and that was originally, as I understand it, the Hershey Lumber Mill offices. Across the street they had the Hershey Lumber Mill there, and this was the offices on this corner. Later on that became a costume jewelry factory, and my sister was telling me that they made some expensive jewelry there. I recall it as more as cheap costume jewelry, but I'm sure they probably made some of each. Then later on, Mr. Bumke bought that building and made apartments there, and the apartments are still there today. The building apparently, as you had suggested a few days ago, it must have been a well-built building because it's still there and
it's been standing quite a number of years.
Right, and it looks like it's in good repair. Moving on down to number 5 there on my chart now, was a lady that lived there. The house was right on the sidewalk, right next to the sidewalk, and her name was Ella Richter. Ella always dressed in black and dark, and she always wore a dark shawl. And I can remember when we were just little kids that the story was that she was a very mean woman. So when we went by there, we really hurried by there. We didn't take our time. I'm sure that was an old wives' tale because I'm sure she was a kindly old lady, but apparently just because she dressed in black, that probably encouraged people to start those kind of stories.
I think, Ralph, mostly in the minds of a kid, they sort of thought of her as a witch or something,
right.
which is built up in their own minds.
Right, right. Moving the pointer on down to number 6 now, this was the old Barbach residence, and I understand prior to that Mr. Hershey, who owned the Hershey Mill across the street, originally built that home. I remember the Barbachs living there. Albert Barbach was a carpenter, and one of the things I can remember about that large yard there, and of course they had a large home as well, but the Mulford Mission and the youth groups there always had a ice cream social, and I can remember the Japanese lanterns that hung from the clotheslines and so forth, and they sold ice cream and pop and those kind of things to make a little money for their Christian endeavors. So I have some fond memories of that yard when I was a little kid growing up. Moving the pointer on down to number 7 now is the old fire station. That building is still there. P&S Electric is in that building today, but that was something that started out actually as the Hershey Hose House volunteer fire department. And Jerry, I think you have some pictures there that you might want the people to see as the camera zooms in on these pictures.
We have 3 of these, Ralph, and we're showing this number 1. Now we're going to show number 2. They are slightly faded, so this is about the best shot we can get of it. Now we'll show number 3.
I guess we have to realize that those pictures are well over.
They're older than we are, Ralph,
right.
Slightly.
Right. Of course, for those of you who are a little bit younger than we are, don't remember the volunteer fire departments, but there was a lot of spirit in those groups, and they had competition. And I know my dad used to tell me that whoever won the race, they were treated to a keg of beer back at the hose house, and they used to have parties and so forth there.
Those men, Ralph, really deserved a lot of credit, because whenever they got the signal for a fire, wherever they were working or whatever, they dropped everything and ran to the hose house, and regardless of weather, temperature, or whatever, they were always responded. And as you said, it was no pay, volunteer. Maybe they got a keg of beer at the end of the year or something like that, but very, very little pay that they received.
Right. Moving on down to number 8 now. I understand there years ago, and this goes back probably to the maybe the 1850s, there was quite a brewery there owned by a fellow by the name of Jacob Dold, who came to Muscatine in 1849, Jerry, and he had that brewery there for 26 years, I understand. Quite an elaborate brewery. I just pinpointed a few of the things that I was able to dig up with help from other people, and he owned 4 acres there, and he had an investment of $30,000, which was quite a sum of money back in those days, into that brewery. The brewery was 2 stories high with an attic, and beneath the vaults was the ice cellar, and there were 5 vaults, and then also the 2 ice cellars. They had 16 vats. Each vat held 25 barrels of beer, and he was quite well known in the area. After he died, his son took over, Charles Dold, and that went on for several years. And for the comments that I got from this little thing that was taken from the library, it said Mr. Dold's reputation as a brewer was A1, so he must have done a good job of brewing that beer.
You have anything, Ralph, in your notes as to whether he just catered to local residents or whether he shipped a beer? Or
I understand that he had customers other than Muscatine, so he must have shipped his beer at least throughout Iowa and probably parts of Illinois.
We don't know as to the reason for the decline of the brewery, as to whether when the family were through with it, the business failed or whatever.
I don't know. I never found that out, why the brewery did fold up and ceased to exist. Then later on, Jerry, the Maid-Rite stand was built there. Fred Angel built that, and I can recall the opening day where Ziegler's band came down and was on the roof. They had a flat-top roof, and they played their band music all day long. And I'm sure you can remember Maid-Rites were 10 cents.
Yes.
And root beer was 5 cents a mug, and Fred always made sure that their mugs were frosted. He kept them cold, and so we have some fond memories of those.
I remember the slogan that they had at that time for the hamburger: all you could eat for a dime.
Oh, yes.
Maid-Rite, all you could eat for a dime.
Uh-huh.
And it was a huge sandwich for a dime.
It really was, almost a
Much
meal.
bigger than that you get today.
Right. How times have changed, huh? Then number 9 there is a building that I understand originally was Libby's Butcher Shop, and this goes back before my time. But that was right next to Bush's drugstore there, which we'll be talking about in a few minutes. But I understand that Mr. Libby had a butcher shop in there. Then later on, the proprietor that I remember there, Jerry, and I think you do too, was a fellow that made some taffy, some delicious taffy, by the name of Charles Freund. And I can recall him standing there in that bay window and stretching that taffy out, and we'd just stand outside and our mouth would just drool. As I recall, he had chocolate and vanilla and strawberry, and it was always a big decision to go in there with a nickel and decide which kind you wanted. And lots of times we used to ask for maybe just a couple pieces of each kind, and he'd always take care of us that way.
I remember going in there and buying some of that taffy, Ralph, and if you bought a piece of that taffy, you could gnaw on it for about an hour, because you had, I could say, gnaw on it to get a bite of it off, but it was really delicious. And I don't know if there is such a thing as saltwater taffy in these days anymore or not. I never hear.
I think you can buy saltwater taffy down in the Florida area, but nothing as good as Mr. Freund had back
Probably
in the days
not.
when we were growing
Not
up.
as we remember it anyway.
Right. I moved my pointer over to number 10 now, Jerry, where the old Bush drugstore was. And we have some stories to tell about Bush's drugstore.
I guess so.
Mr. Bush started that drugstore there and ran it until such time as he was passed away, and then Edna Bush ran it. She was not able to fill prescriptions, but she did sell over-the-counter drugs and so forth. But I can remember one particular way that I was involved with Bush's drugstore. You know, when we were kids, we always thought it was smart to smoke. And of course, it was almost impossible for kids in those days to buy cigarettes. It's not quite as easy as it is now. It wasn't quite as easy. So we used to go there and buy what we called cubebs. There was 10 in a package. And they were supposed to be medicinal, I suppose, for your lungs or something like that. So we always used to go in there and buy, whenever we got it 10 cents a head, we'd buy a package of those cubebs and then sneak up on the hill and smoke them. And I can remember they just burnt like weeds. They'd crack and pop, and if you smoked them too short, you could burn your tongue pretty badly on them.
That's true. If you smoked them too short, you'd suck some flame into your mouth,
Right.
which wasn't very comfortable. I remember also going into that drugstore as a child and buying what they called sweet wood, and it was actually wood. It was about like a twig, only it had a sort of a licorice flavor, and as you chewed on that and mixed with your saliva, of course, it was quite juicy and also flavorful. And I recall that some of the mothers were concerned that if you chewed on that twig too long, you might swallow some of those slivers of wood, which wouldn't be too great for your stomach.
Right.
That was always a caution. Now, don't swallow any of that wood.
Right, right. I got ahead of myself here with a slide. I want to go back and pick up the corner there at the corner of Green and Hershey, which was the old Whiteway Hotel. Prior to that, I understand, Jerry, that a fellow named Apple had a saloon there at number 11, where we will move our pointer over to so you can identify this building right at the corner of the bottom of the hill of Green Street and Hershey Avenue. A fellow by the name of Apple owned a saloon there and had that there for a good many years. And I understand upstairs he had a hall and held dances up there. Then some of the people that were getting married and those kind of things had celebrations. They always hired the hall there, so there was a lot of gala activities there on that corner. Then later on, a fellow named Mr. and Mrs. McDowell had what we know now as the Whiteway Hotel. Now it's fallen into quite a bit of disrepair, but he had a place there that was quite well known. He had a restaurant there, and I understand had a bar there at one time and so forth. Now it's vacant, and like I said, has come into quite a bit of disrepair.
Yes, at one time it was a thriving business and very important business, and it's unfortunate that it has fallen into this state of repair. At one time it was a real nice building, and the inside of it was really furnished nice, but in the late years it's just fallen into decline.
Right. I've changed my transparencies now, Jerry, and I'll move this pointer over to number 12 and identify that spot for you. That was the shoe shop. I understand the first man in there was a fellow by the name of Mike Namath, and he repaired shoes. Of course, in those days, we didn't throw a pair of shoes away. We had them half sold
That's
about
true.
as many times as they would
That's true.
take it. And I don't recall what a pair of half soles cost, but I'm sure it was probably under $1. And soles and heels, and then following him was a fellow by the name of Martin Lange, and I remember Martin.
I remember him too, Ralph.
Yes, and he was had a shoe shop there at the same time. Then number 11, Jerry, used to be a vacant lot, and I can remember going over there because I was pretty well raised in the Sloughtown area. I can remember going over there as a little boy playing commies and marbles. And I suppose if you talked to some kid today, they'd wonder what in the world you were talking about. But we used to play big rings, which were probably 8 or 9 foot across. And the idea was to knock those marbles or crystals out of the ring, and whatever you knocked out of the ring was yours. And we also played small rings as well.
How many times, Ralph, by playing marbles, didn't we wind up with sore knuckles and chapped hands? And of course that would bother us quite a bit till we got to the next game, and after we got in the game we didn't care whether sore knuckles or whatever, but usually we paid for it afterwards.
Right.
Knuckles would be cracked and sore and split open. But
Exactly right.
those were the entertainment for the boys. And
Right, right. You could buy a pretty good sack of marbles for a nickel.
Yes.
And they were made out of clay and colored different colors.
Some were glass.
Yeah, right. Yeah, right. And I can always remember the kids would say, "Keep your knuckles down now. You can't raise your hand up and get the benefit of getting over the ring or something."
One
like that.
expression, Ralph, was "knuckles down, skinny bones tight."
Right,
I don't know
right.
what that meant, but and I think it meant was don't cheat.
Right, exactly right. Then moving on to number 14, my brother tells me that there was a picture show there in the early days, and of course it was without sound. It was silent movies, but for a number of years there was a picture show there, and I guess the kids used to try and sneak in whenever they could.
I wonder if that wouldn't have been likened to what they used to call the Nickelodeon. When from what I hear, when they first started the movies, the admission was 5 cents, and therefore at that time they were known as Nickelodeons. Of course, that word has changed in meaning in the late years, but seemed to me like I heard that that's what they called the first movie house.
Very possible, Jerry. I've moved my pointer on now down to number 15 there. It's right on there's a little short stub alley there, but I'm told that the first business there that can be recalled by some of the people that I know was a hardware store. I don't remember, or I couldn't find out who ran that hardware store, but later on I can remember there was a dewdrop in there that was ran by a couple of women, and so they had another restaurant there for a number of years. Then crossing the little short stub alley there was the Eitman grocery store, and that brings back a lot of fond memories about the Eitman grocery store. Of course, my wife, her dad, Fred Eitman, was a partner in that grocery store, so my wife has a lot of fond memories of Eitman grocery store as well. I understand that Frank Eitman would have been my wife's grandfather. Started that store back in the 1850s, I understand, and then after he passed away, the three brothers, Frank and Joe and Fred, ran that grocery store. Their hours were like from 6 in the morning till 9 at night, so they had long grocery store hours. One of the other things that I recall about that Eitman grocery store was they had a large upright carousel candy display.
I recall
that. And we used to go in with a penny or a nickel, and we'd turn that thing and just shop and shop and shop for 10 or 15 minutes. Finally, we decided maybe we'd want several kinds, and they were always so patient to get out a little brown sack and get a few of each kind, and then take our money. So I always remember those days when you could shop for a long time for some candy and make it last as long as you possibly could.
I have some memories of that Eitman store also, Ralph. The one thing that stays in my mind is the threshold as you went in the doorway. You had to either step on or step over a large, thick threshold, and in the middle of that threshold was a large knot. And from the many footsteps crossing that threshold, on each side of the knot there was a depression that was worn by footsteps going over the threshold. But that knot never wore a bit. It just stood there for years and got polished by time, I guess. And then inside the store, I can recall the huge coffee grinder they had there. That was really a large thing, and on each side of it, they had, I guess they were what you might call balance wheels. They were huge steel wheels, and the coffee grinder was turned with a crank. And after you got that thing cranked up, well, of course, it ground the coffee. But if after the coffee was ground, if you let go of the handle, that thing seemed like it run for 5 minutes, even from the momentum those wheels had caused. And then also, Ralph, I remember they had a delivery service, which was they delivered with horse and wagon. And if you would look at the screen and back up there to that alley, if you went up that alley, that's where they had their stables, and they stabled their horses back up in there.
I understand too, Jerry, and I didn't know this till I just talked to the Eitman women just in a last few days, that they used to go out in the morning to these various homes and pick up grocery orders, and then they go back to the store and fill those orders and then deliver them like from noon on. So that people in those days got lots of service for a little bit of money.
They certainly did.
Yeah. I also remember the Eitman grocery store there. The fellow named of Mr. Custer, who was a rural mail carrier. He always used to pull up there, and I can remember him stopping his horse and his cart there and going into the grocery store there, probably picking up a few food items or whatever he bought, maybe a chew of tobacco. I don't know whether he did that or not, but something there that he stopped there every morning. And I also understand that that was probably, there weren't a lot of phones in those days, so it might have been that he might have been checking back at the post office just to see if he'd missed any mail or something. He stopped there every morning and then headed out west on Hershey Avenue to deliver his mail.
He may have had to stop there to load up on provisions, Ralph, because those rural mail carriers in those days, they were out for all day, and especially in the wintertime, it might take them a lot longer to deliver their mail than in good weather.
Right. The thought just occurred to me, Jerry, Mrs. Jones out in the country might have needed a loaf of bread or something, too.
That's true. He might have had that kind of a service, too.
Right. Moving on down to number 17 there now. I understand a long time ago, probably around about 1900, there was a saloon in there. I don't recall that. There might be someone out there looking that recalls a saloon being in there, but later on there was an ice cream parlor there, just one of several in Sloughtown. As I got into this, I realized again that this was just a little community within a community. Almost everything that you could possibly need.
They really were unique, weren't they?
They really were, and there was a lot of camaraderie and a lot of closeness, neighborly type things that I'm sure they found in other sections of the town as well. One of the quotes that I used to hear when I was growing up, and of course there were a lot of German people in the area, and they always used to say, Sloughtown über alles. That meant Sloughtown overall, and they were very proud of their little community.
Getting back to that saloon, I don't have any information as who owned it or ran it, but I remember my dad telling about had a rather unique way of cooling it. They had troughs built in the floor, and they would set huge ice cakes over those troughs. And of course this would be in the summertime, and that cooled the building down. And then of course the men would sit around, and if they had a glass of beer, they just set it right on the ice, and that would keep their beer cool and also keep them cool.
Mm-hmm. Talked to Marie Eichmann before she passed away this past year, and she said that the kids in the area used to come in the evening with fruit jars and buckets and go into the saloon and get those filled for their dad. So when he came home from work at 6 o'clock, after he had his meal, he could have a little beer. And she said they always envied those kids. They weren't allowed to go in the saloons, but they always envied those kids because the bartender or the saloon keeper always used to give them a drink of pop, and of course they weren't allowed to get in, so they didn't get in on that refreshment of pop.
Yeah, in those days, Ralph, it was common practice to take a bucket, a metal bucket, or I guess a syrup bucket or whatever, to the saloon and get it filled. And there was an expression for that. They called it "shoot the can."
Oh, I never heard that before, Jerry. I moved my pointer on down to number 18 there now, which was the old Couts home. They lived there for a good number of years, and Rammy Couts, I recall, drove for the Couts Bakery, which was uptown. He was one of the Couts family. Moving on down to number 19 now, we're at the corner of Main Street and Hershey. There's been several businesses in there. One of the earlier ones was the Libby Shoe Repair. Here again was another shoe repair business. And then later on, following that, Louis Roseman had an ice cream stand there. Then following him, there were several fellas in there that ran the ice cream store, and at that time, I think it was called the Pearl City. Ray Wintermute and Mr. Jefferson and Mr. Freers ran that, and they, of course, started with fresh cream, and I can remember my brother ran a cream route out in the country, and I used to ride with him from time to time. Farmers sold him fresh cream, and they brought it in and made ice cream out of it. You know, I have fond recollection of eating that soft ice cream. That was so delicious. I used to run around with Warren Wintermute, and that was his dad who ran that store, so we had kind of an in to get ice cream quite often, and I look forward to that.
You're talking about the ice cream store, Ralph. You know, back in those days, there was stories told about the immigrants, mostly German immigrants in the south part of town, and some of these stories, we don't know if they're true or not, but one that I did hear concerning the ice cream store, there's a young German immigrant working in the store, and a customer came in and asked him what flavor of ice cream he had, and the young German immigrant had a sore throat and he couldn't talk very plain, so he just says strawberry, chocolate, and vanilla. And the customer says, do you have laryngitis? He says, no, just chocolate, strawberry, and vanilla. Now you can take that for what it's worth.
Okay. While you've been telling that little story, I moved my pointer over to number 20 now. Now that's another corner of Maine and Hershey, and the present-day Salvation Army is situated there. But prior to that, the Mulford Mission or Mulford Church was built there in about right after the turn of the century. We also have very fond memories of that. Miss Mulford was the kind of the spearhead of building that church there on the corner, and her history goes way back to an old teacher of Franklin School. And I understand from talking to Miss Eitman that Miss Eitman and Miss Mulford were co-teachers. But Miss Mulford really got a burden for the kids in that area of hanging around the saloons, and she felt that a Sunday school should be started right in that area. There were earlier Sunday schools, a carryover from this Sunday school, and we'll touch on that a little bit later. But this was her main thrust there, that she provide some kind of religious training for these young kids. Jerry, I think you have a picture there of the Christian Endeavor right here, and I thought maybe some of the people would like to see that. I don't know whether they can zoom in on that while I'm talking or not, but that's a picture of the Christian Endeavor that was probably right after the turn of the century, around 1900, 1905, somewhere along in there. Miss Mulford is in that picture. I'm not sure I could identify her, but she is in that picture there. There was another lady that was involved in this too by the name of Hoover. So those two people, Bertha Hoover, they were really instrumental in getting this church started. This was kind of one of the results of Billy Sunday being in Muscatine. And Billy Sunday came, I think, 1905, 1906, 1907, along in there somewhere. And there was quite a large tabernacle built on the corner of 8th and Iowa. And they had something like a 6 weeks sessions there every night. And there were a lot of people that were converted during those meetings. And several people got a burden. The First Congregational Church used to be downtown. Several of those people wanted to see a church established. And at that point in time, Miss Mulford and Miss Hoover, along with several people from up there, saw that this building was built. Miss Mulford was the great money raiser, and she contacted several business people in Muscatine, and they contributed some money to that. One of the more prominent businessmen contributed quite a sum of money in those days, with one stipulation, that this church be called Mulford Mission. He definitely wanted Miss Mulford's name connected with this church. She was rather reluctant to do that, but she felt that they would have to have that money to build that church. So
I think it was fitting, Ralph, that it should have been named after her, being she had worked so hard to.
Yeah, that's true. Then we're going to move our pointer up here to number 21, and that building right there was the old Roseman Ice House. Now there were several Rosemans that ran that, and that's where they kept their ice wagons and horses. And then they also kept their ice down on in the 1500 block of New Hampshire Street. There was a large ice house down there. I can remember when that blew over one night. It was empty then. It was no longer as a business, but they kept their ice down there on New Hampshire Street. That reminds me of a story about Mr. Barbach, who we talked about earlier. He was in the process of tearing that down and then built a home there later on. And I was over there playing one day because I just lived a couple doors away, and I broke one of his 2x4s. And boy, he really got mad at me, and he was going to tell my dad and everything, and I was almost afraid to go home. I think his bark was worse than his bite, because he was a pretty nice person, but he just wanted to make sure that I didn't break any more of his lumber.
This ice, Ralph, that you had reference to, of course, was river ice, which was harvested in the wintertime and then stored in these ice houses. I recall being in an ice house way back when, and they would store those kegs in there and insulate them with sawdust or straw, and that sort of, I guess, kept them more or less insulated, so the cakes wouldn't melt so fast.
Right. I'm glad you brought that up, Jerry, because some of this generation today just wouldn't realize that a lot of the ice came right from the river and also from the slough as well.
True.
And now I'm going to move my pointer up here to the right up the extreme corner of our printout here, and right up there was a Holzhauer button factory. I'm sure you recall that they hired or employed quite a few button cutters. That was one of the main industries in Muscatine, going back quite a few years.
That button shop in the later years was owned and operated by the Iowa Pearl Button Company.
That's true. I'd forgotten about that.
They operated it until the small button shops, the decline of the pearl button industry, I guess you'd say.
Right. I moved my pointer down now back to I suppose you'd call that the southwest corner of Hershey Avenue in Maine, where there was a blacksmith shop there. Very fascinating for us young kids. There were a lot of horses shoed there, and the Franklin brothers ran that. And I can recall if we had our wagon was broken or our sled or skates or something like that we wanted fixed, why Mr. Franklin always fixed that for us. Very seldom did he ever charge us for it. That was always just one of the services that he provided for the kids in the neighborhood.
I remember Ralph, one of the Franklin brothers was a rather small man, not what you'd picture as the village blacksmith with the strong and brawny arms. He was just a little fellow, and he could handle the horses, and he'd done a good job of shoeing, but he wasn't what you would picture as a strong man, as a blacksmith.
Right, right. You recall looking up into the rafters and hundreds of shoes and various sizes and shapes that they used to have up there. Going down Main Street now, just a half a block, right there on the corner of the alley, there was a building there that I understand originally was a Art Franklin's grocery store. Now, I don't recall this at all, but I was talking to, here again, someone a little bit older than I, and Art Franklin had a grocery store in there at one time. That was the original use of the building. Later on, I can remember McDowell, Mr. McDowell had a dairy in there, and he also had a ice cream parlor there too as well. I can remember one time, well, of course probably several times, but we used to live just down the alley from there, and he used to stand there in back and wash his milk bottles. And he always had a little cigar in his mouth that he'd puff along. I think he chewed it more than he smoked it. But us kids used to wait till he finished that, and then he'd toss it out in the alley. And when he wasn't looking, we'd go up and grab that cigar and take it down, hide it in one of the barns and smoke it. Now, it almost makes me sick to think about that today, but kids will be kids, I guess. I know that kids wouldn't do that today.
As I recall him, Ralph, I don't know if anybody ever saw him light a fresh cigar. That stub always seemed to be perennial in his mouth. There's always a certain size, and like you say, I think he chewed it more than he smoked. But there's another story that which is a true story that I might interject here. Back in the days of the dairies, when the dairies delivered to different communities or different parts of town, there were perhaps 6 or 8 dairies, some more prominent than others. Mr. McDowell was just one of the smaller dairies. But at that time, there was a city ordinance that each one of the dairies had to submit a bottle of milk, I think once a month, and this bottle of milk was taken to the public health office, was tested for bacteria or whatever, and then in the following couple of days, the results of that test would be published in the paper. Well, at this particular time, my dad was on a police force, and it fell to him to be his job as to run down every one of these dairies and get a bottle of milk from each dairy, and then take them to wherever they tested this milk, and of course they took it from there. This one particular day, Dad had contacted every dairy but one, and this one dairy he tried to find and went all over his route, but he couldn't find him. So in this course of tracing this one particular dairy, he ran into Mr. McDowell's, who was delivering milk, and of course he had already gotten a bottle of milk from Mr. McDowell, but my dad told Mr. McDowell of his situation when Mr. McDowell offered him another bottle of milk. Well, my dad says a bottle of milk is a bottle of milk. So he put the label on that was the name of the dairy that he couldn't find, and submitted that as belonging to that dairy. And as a result, when the results came out, Mr. McDowell was in one of the highest brackets, And Mr. McDowell told Dad afterwards, that's the highest test I ever got for my mill.
Quite interesting. Moving on down Main Street now, I didn't put that on our transparency, but I think you will recall that E.X. Bauer had quite an establishment of mustard and horseradish and so forth, and so he made that horseradish and mustard down there. And I understand that when he was passed away, that he took his recipe with him. I guess he didn't make that available to anyone else. Then we're going to move our pointer back up here to number 26, Jerry, and right there on the corner there were a lot of flowers and raised there by the walls and the Holzhauers, a lot of tulips and irises. And around Decoration Day, used to be a lot of people stop there and buy bouquets and take those up to the cemetery to decorate the graves on Decoration Day.
I recall that yard of flowers. It was really beautiful, and it served two purposes, Ralph. People could buy flowers, and also when you were around there, you could enjoy the beauty of the flowers. And they all seemed to bloom at one time. They were all in bloom, mostly all at one time.
Moving on now to the house here. This is where the halls and the walls, rather, and the Holzhauers lived. And of course, they had quite a yard of flowers there. Then we're going to cross Roselawns Avenue right here and come over to this corner, number 28, on our transparency. And that has quite a history of several businesses in there. The original business that I was able to ferret out was Jake Stibling's Saloon. And there's quite a story about that, too. I understand that when when Miss Mulford the church was built there on the opposite corner over there, that there was an ordinance in town that you could not have a saloon within 300 feet of the church. So when the church was built, even though it wasn't there when Jake had his saloon originally, that they okayed the church, well then that made the saloon illegal. So she went to see the city fathers about this business, and they come down and told him he'd have to close his saloon. Well, Jake was not to be outdone. He did close the front door, but he opened up the back door, and that put him within legal limits. So he carried on his business.
I recall telling that actually what he did was board up the front of it,
right.
So he complied in a way.
Right, he sure did. But I also like to recall that Jake's Saloon has long been out of business, and Mulford Church is still thriving. The Lord's still working there, right?
Right.
But then and also in that building later on then was Bloom's Grocery, and of course they remodeled that and built it up quite a bit, and they had quite a thriving business.
They were one of the largest stores
they really
in town, really.
Right, really. They covered a lot of territory, and they were in business for a good many years. Then right next door to that, number 29 here on the chart, was, as far as I could tell, the first business in there was another drugstore, Jerry.
Oh, I never went.
Esslinger's Drugstore was in there. Marie Eichmann was telling me about this when she was still living. And then following that was an ice cream parlor, another ice cream parlor again. There must have been a lot of ice cream eaters in those days.
Yes.
Then following that, I think, was John Downey ran a restaurant in there.
I recall when he was in there.
And John wanted to move uptown and open up a restaurant downtown. So at that time, he sold that to my dad and my brother, and they moved in there, and I think in maybe the late 20s, early 30s, during Depression times. Things were very difficult then. So my early recollection was I grew up there for several years till I got married. But I also remember waiting on table because we used to serve meals for 35 cents. And that included meat, potatoes, and gravy, and a side dish.
All the basics.
All the basics. And as I recall, it even included a wedge of pie and your drink, all for 35 cents. And we had quite a few customers that used to come down from McKee, Button, and other places at 12 o'clock. And we used to have quite a rush hour there between 12 and 1. Right. Then right next door was an empty lot for a good many years. There was a bench in there for a long time, and that was kind of a loafer's bench. You came to Sloughtown where you could sit on the bench and have talk and so forth.
Watch the horses go by.
Right, watch the horses go by. Then later on, Ralph Roman built a food locker there, and that's still there today. I'm not sure just what kind of business is in there at the present time. It might be empty. I'm not sure about that. Then going over here, crossing the alley to number 31 on the transparency here was Roman Libby's. But prior to that, and Jerry, I think you have a picture of that, of the John Apple grocery store. Now that was, the Apples were a relation to the Eitmans, but they had a grocery store there at one time. Long before, I guess, Roman Libby's had a meat market there. It was John Apple's grocery store. They lived up above there, and they had a large yard out in back. Then later on, after they gave up their grocery business, Roman Libby's had a butcher shop there for a good many years. And there were a lot of cattle and so forth that were killed there, and hogs. And they started right from scratch and cut them up and sold them over the counter. And also they had a delivery route, too, as well. There was quite a crew of people that worked over the years.
I remember very well Roman Libby's, and I recall the sawdust on the floor as you walked in there. And if I can interject another immigrant story, which you can believe it or not, it was supposedly a stranger going through Sloughtown had stopped one of the German immigrants and was asking directions, and all he got from the immigrant was, "I don't know." Finally, the traveler got sort of disgusted, and he said, "Well, what do you know?" The immigrant says, "I know that Roman Libby has good bologna."
Yeah, and what was the cost of a ring of bologna then?
I think at one time there were 3 for a quarter. Three rings for a quarter.
Right, yeah. They made some very good bologna too. I know when we were in the Freese Inn there that we used to go over and get 5 pounds of hamburger at a time, and we'd buy it on a need basis, so it was always fresh, and it was just excellent hamburgers. I can remember the sandwiches that we made were quite large, and those sold for 10 cents as well. And we always poked a hole right in the middle of that hamburger. And my mother always told me that cooked from the inside out and from the outside in. And that was one of her secrets. We always fried them in a deep fat.
I'll have to tell my wife about that one, Ralph.
And they also put them in flour. So they patted them out in flour and then flipped them over. So there was flour on the outside, a hole in the middle, and they were probably about that big around. Very, very delicious. As
Bargains.
I recall. Oh, bargain. Right. Almost as good as the made rice later on. Also, in that building where we talked a little bit about the Roman Libby, then later on, right on the corner, was the Axel's grocery store. And then following that was the Hershey Avenue Market, which Toby Tobias and another fellow was in there, Walter Schmidt and Toby Tobias. Axel's grocery store was in there for a good many years. And then right outside that, Jerry, was, I'm sure you recall this, was a drinking fountain, a horse trough for the horses as they came around the corner there. They could stop there and water their horses. And alongside of that was a little drinking fountain where you could get a drink yourself.
Always a nice cold drink of water.
Right, right. And that corner was very popular corner because remember when the circuses came to town?
Yeah.
That was where
that was their route.
Right, a lot of people got on that corner because they could see it from different angles, so they could get a good shot of the clowns and the elephants and the tigers and all those kind of things. We used to get up early in the morning and watch the circuses unload, and then at about noon they come by with a parade and go uptown and then come back again. So we'd watch them going up and watch them coming back on that corner. I'm going to change the slide here now, Jerry, and get another portion of Sloughtown. Over here on this corner, Jerry, was actually where the Mulford Sunday School got its start. There was a little building there. I don't recall the fellow's name. I had it at one time, but I misplaced that. He started there with just a little group of kids, and he outgrew that building, and then they moved up here to what was later known as the Rooms, up here on Green Street. I have the numbers. The numbers here was 312 Green and 320 Green. They called those the Rooms, and at that particular time, that's when Miss Mulford got involved there, and also Marie Eichmann. And then when they outgrew that, they moved over to where the Salvation Army is now. And later on, they moved down to the corner of Charles and Hershey. but that's quite a story in itself. So that, actually the Mulford mission goes back well over 100 years. Then down here at this corner also, that building is still there. As we remember it now, it's Carver's Corner, but years ago that was a canning factory, Ziegler's Canning Factory, and of course they canned tomatoes and cabbage, those kind of things there.
Pumpkin, I believe, too, Ralph.
Pumpkin, yeah, that's right. I do recall Smalley's bringing cabbage and pumpkins and those kind of things up for canning. But prior to that even, Jerry, there was the Hershey lumber mill there, and that took up that whole corner here, all this area in here. And of course we all can remember or hearing stories about how the logs were floated down the Mississippi and were landed there and split into lumber and then been into building material. An offshoot of that was the Beach and Stewart's Lumber Company, which is still there today, is known as Beach's Lumber Company. And over the years, has always been a place where you could buy finished lumber and so forth. Then moving on up to one other place there I didn't call your attention to up to this point was down here on the lower block of Green Street was the Puritan Ice Company. Now they made ice out of just water. They didn't cut their ice out of the river, so they had quite a selling point. You could drink that water without worrying about it being river water. And I can remember they had quite a thriving business there, the Puritan Ice Company.
I recall that Puritan Ice Company, and I also at one time thought I would try to eat some of that ice, but it had an awful bitter taste, so I gave that up. It was something evidently that they made the ice, some kind of chemical that was in the ice, but it had an awful bitter taste. I recall that.
I moved my pointer back here to the Muscatine Slough because originally, the slough came out of Mississippi and swung across the back part of Beaches there and crossed Grandview Avenue right there at the intersection of Green and Grandview Avenue. So there used to be a bridge across there, and of course the slough continued on down where it is today, and then gets back into the Mississippi at the Port Louisa. Moving on up now to McKee Button Company, which at that time I understand was known as McKee and Bliven. In fact, they're still in business today as McKee Button Company. They still make plastic buttons.
Mostly into plastics
right,
now.
Right. In those days, it was all pearl buttons. And I can recall back when I was carrying papers, this was probably in the maybe late 20s, early 30s, they were on strike. The button cutters were on strike. And I can remember a sign over there they had a large steel or iron picket fence. And on this sign, it had up at the top, gross wages was $12. And then there was a cost, I think, of $1.50 for button cutters, saws, and plugs and so forth. By the time they got to their take-home pay, they got $10.50 for a week. As I recall, they were probably working 10 or 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, so that wasn't a lot of money in those days, and they wanted to raise. And I don't recall how they come out, but they were a little upset that they weren't getting a lot of money for the work that they were producing. And also understand, Jerry, that the gross of buttons in those days was 168 count. It wasn't 144 as we know what a gross is. But
what's actually what sprung from the gross was what they call the great gross.
Oh yes.
And that's they added that on, and the button cutters always said that they were stealing that from them because that was just extra for the button company.
I think the thinking behind that probably was that there were a few buttons that were no good.
Yes.
So they made it from 144 to 168 to take care of those losses.
The button cutters thought that was just a little bit strong because they never really had that many bad ones.
Right. Well, we've pretty well covered everything there in Sloughtown, Jerry. Why don't we just catch the streetcar here on this corner? Let's play like we're catching a streetcar, and we'll move uptown just in the next few minutes and show you a few pictures that belong to the Eitmans down there on Hershey Avenue. A few pictures that are actually from West 2nd Street. Now, we can't identify those, but they are from 2nd Street, and we've talked about those before we were shown them, and we just can't recall when those things were on 2nd Street, but they're quite interesting, and we thought maybe you'd like to see those for just remaining minutes that we have.
Okay, we'll show you another one that we have here at the same vicinity, maybe at a different location. Those, of course, were back in the days of the dirt, muddy streets. We can't describe what the arches and everything were, just some sort of decorations, I suppose. But these go back further than we can recall, Ralph. And as the years have faded with the time, it's sometimes difficult to find out information on some of these older things, because the people that would know have long since been with us.
You have another one there, Jerry, behind that one there?
I seem to have had two together there, Ralph.
Okay. No one that I've talked to can recognize that at all, but apparently in years past that was there on 2nd Street somewhere.
Well, Ralph, this your presentation has been interesting and also refreshed my memory about Sloughtown. It was one time very familiar to me, especially the businesses and all the stores, because I recall being in most of them, and the thriving business that it was. It seems to be unfortunate that it's declined in the years, of course, with the smaller businesses going the way of they have, giving way to the large businesses. And then I don't know for sure, but I think some of the decline of the business up there in Sloughtown came from the parking meters, and of course then some of the business run by families. The older people died and the younger people weren't interested, and through the years the business just faded.
Well, Jerry, I've enjoyed talking to you about one of my favorite places in Muscatine, Sloughtown, and I understand that in future weeks we might be highlighting some of the other sections of town. So until such time, we want to thank the Cable Vision audience, and I hope you've enjoyed it as much as we have. So until then, have a good day, and we'll see you later.